Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Continuing under sustainable manufacturing sector, we have Mr. Peter, or rather Mr. Michael Peter, who's the Executive Director of Forestry South Africa. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and greetings to all of the colleagues and the Honourable Minister. I'm sorry, I've just said share screen, but I think you need to allow me to share it. It says I can't share screen. I'm not sure if colleagues can see my screen yet. It says the host has disabled participant screen sharing. I don't know if that can be corrected, please, Program Director. There we go. Yeah, I'm in. Thank you very much. Please let me know if you can see that. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So thank you very much to the FP&M Seta, to Dr. Yende and the colleagues for inviting me to make this presentation. Big shoes to fill after the Honourable Minister's address. He didn't mention it in his address, but there's a banner on top that the Honourable Minister is the executive for the Human Resource Development Council that's chaired by our Deputy President. So, everything he said is of extreme importance, not just for this skills summit, but I think across business in South Africa. Chair, I was asked to talk about the ERRP, and I think before we talk about economic reconstruction, we need to talk about what are we reconstructing around, and the Deputy Minister made reference to COVID-19, but in actual fact there are a number of other, this is not forwarding, I wonder why that's not going forward. Let's try that arrow. There are a number of other issues from which we are trying to recover, and these go back as far as 2008. In fact, in 2007, with the introduction of the National Credit Act, which was actually a very good thing that government did, to stop reckless expenditure by consumers. But the impact that had on our industry is that the number of new houses that were built in 2008 compared to those in 2007 halved. And the consequence of that is that our timber volumes used to be around that time 22 million cubic meters per annum. And they dropped quite sharply within the next couple of years, in the next couple of years to 16 million cubic meters per annum. And they are still around that level today. So it's not just COVID that has impacted our industry. We then had what I call the decade of disaster, and on a daily basis, we see more horror stories coming out of the Zondo reports. To be fair, our industry wasn't badly affected by state capture. If you read the Zondo report, it suggests only 5.7 million was stolen from Safcol during the state capture exercise. But the impact on the sector through state capture more generally in the country has been massive. And you can see here the figures that have been thrown around, possibly as much as R1 trillion has been misappropriated, misspent, and so on. And this is money that didn't go to the people, in whose name it was misappropriated under radical economic transformation. A lot of it has been salted away offshore. Hopefully Minister Gorongwana will use his powers to try and repatriate some of that money. And it certainly didn't go towards job creation during that decade. So that has had a knock-on impact on consumers and on our sector and other sectors, because had that money gone into our economy, created employment, that would have created additional demand. And then, of course, as the Minister mentioned, we had the impacts of COVID-19 in 2020. And here, really, this is a big shout out to government, to thank government. Honestly, it had not been for the presidency-led PPGI, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the declaration of certain of our products being declared essential goods and services, we would have had a much bigger loss than that impairment that you see. We lost about 5 billion rand in 2020 from what we had projected our revenues would be, and that figure would have been closer to 15 billion rand had it not been for the vision of our government, to which the Minister alluded in his address. We saw what happened in the States, you saw what happened in the EU. Honestly, I think our government can take huge credit for the exemplary handling of the COVID-19 crisis. Yes, of course, there were mistakes made. That would happen anyway. But if you compare on average how South Africa did, I think we did extraordinarily well. And certainly our sector benefited from early state intervention. And then, Chair, we had the failed insurrection in 2021 by the reported supporters of the now convicted criminal and former President of South Africa, Jacob Zuma. What was the impact of that on our sector? Well, 656 million rand was lost in production and in fires in those 2.5 weeks, or 2 weeks. Of bigger concern in all of that is 50 billion rand wiped out of the retail sector and so on. And again, these things have a knock-on impact on our sector, on the other manufacturing sectors that are part of the FP&M Seta. So it's good to not see these things in isolation. What's going on in Ukraine at the moment is going to have a direct impact on South Africa. As much as we aren't big importers or exporters to Russia and Ukraine, if that spills over into Europe, which it already is with counter-sanctions, and so on and so forth. And Europe feels the pinch, and the US feels the pinch, and possibly China feels the pinch. Well, those are our big export markets. So again, something that happens in KwaZulu-Natal that people think, well, this is affecting the retail sector, has a knock-on effect in our sectors and others. And then we had other challenges from which we're trying to recover, which is the loss of plantation area. Unfortunately, our Department of Forestry, Fisheries, Environment has multiple failures that they haven't been able to address. Forest protection, the devastating fires in the Southern Cape in 2017 and 2018, the failure to renew an MOU for working on pests and diseases with the industry over the last 5 years, delays in amending the National Veld and Forest Fire legislation, and so on and so forth. And then something not to do with the department, but we've also seen conversion to other land uses, where people are finding it more profitable to plant avocados and macadamias in many parts of the country. So not all of this is at the doorstep of government, but these are all things from which we're recovering. So enough about the bad news, Chair. What are we doing about this? I was asked to talk about the master plan, but before that, I think it's important to talk about the Public-Private Growth Initiative. This is a presidential-led initiative, which in 2018, following our president's first State of the Nation address and his reference to Hugh Masekela Song Tumamena, he moved a number of people in business. The late Dr. Johan van Zyl, who sadly passed to COVID last year, with Dr. Rolf Meyer, approached the president in 2018 and said, we've been moved by your speech. What can we do as business to turn around this lost decade under the previous administration? And so the president said, go and talk to business and find out what investments you can muster together. Business collectively agreed to muster over 500 billion rand in new investment to support the president and his administration. From our sector-specific inputs, we have committed 23.9 billion in new investments with potential additional 14 billion rand in new capacity, provided government can unblock the things that have been blocking that investment over the last decade and in fact longer. We had committed to 108,000 new jobs, and to the minister's point, 5,000 artisanal jobs as part of that. We'd also committed to improve the sector's rating, which is already quite good at level 4 overall, to level 3 over the 5-year period. And we had hoped to increase our contribution to GDP from 1.9 to 2.5%. In terms of what were these PPGR commitments, well, from industry side, it was upgrading of pulp and paper mills, expansion, modernization of sawmills, investments in renewable energy, and the planting of 151,000 hectares of new plantations. From the government side, our single biggest constraints have been the lack of recapitalization of areas that were damaged to pests, diseases, and fires in the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal, the lack of recapitalization of the state's own plantations, what are referred to as the category B and C plantations, both of which initiatives, along with the last one, which is implementing the 10-year-old cabinet decision to recapitalize state plantations in the Western Cape and Mpumalanga, would provide a source of additional new fiber, would create employment. Most of those jobs, those 108,000 jobs, are in actual fact in the plantation sector, but we haven't seen any movement on those last 3 bullets over the last 5 years. And so this is hampering our efforts to implement. So what did we do from the PPGR? This was then channeled into the Forestry Sector Master Plan, which I was asked to talk about. These are plans which the DTRC put together, but that sector lead departments need to take forward. Initially, we were frustrated, saying, but we've gone through the PPGR process, the presidency, we have a plan, can we not get on to implementation? But we embraced it as it went along because we realized that there's a lot more than what we put into the PPGR. In the PPGR, we were only asked for mega investments. So you only saw figures of billions in individual projects, whereas there's a whole lot more billions that are being spent by smaller entities and smaller companies, which also had binding constraints which we could embed into the master plan. The meetings are being held for the master plan somewhat haphazardly and on short notice, but the biggest concern is that our lead department of Forestry, Fisheries, Environment's responsibilities have not been met, and those are the ones that I refer to in those last 3 bullets on the bottom. It's not all bad news from industry side. We've made good on our investments, and as of September of last year, we had invested in the 3 years since we signed this compact with the presidency, we'd invested 11.7 billion rand in new capacity in the industry. We've had successes in the water space, in the crime space by the president in his declaration of economic crimes as priority crimes. We've received funding for the first time for black participants in forestry through the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Land Reform, and everybody knows about the successes in the renewable energy space that are starting to come online again through the president's leadership. We're also seeing encouraging signs in the field of logistics, and again to the president's State of the Nation address, the promise of third-party access to rail and ports, which we think Transnet will welcome because it increases their capacity, creates passive income for them, and create those partnerships with the public and the private sector and labour, to which the Minister referred in his address. The other thing we were asked to talk about was small, medium and micro enterprise support. The ESD and SED, and Ms. Mavimbela will be addressing the Skills Summit later. But these are two critical elements on our BEE scorecard. And they are the areas where industry traditionally scores the highest. And I always say to people, people get caught up on ownership, but ownership is a double-edged sword. When you own equity and the business gets into trouble, you lose money and you become liable. Whereas when you're supporting other enterprises to support that business, and your business might get into trouble, as the Minister said in his address, once you've skilled people up and trained them in business with other skills, they can take those skills into other companies or even other sectors. So we think those are the most important things that we should be focusing on as part of our SMME support. We produced an extremely encouraging CSR narrative. Mr. Norman Dlamini, who's our Business Development Director, updated this last year to also, by the way, include the impacts of COVID-19 and our sector's response in partnering with government to address it. And that's available on our website, which I'll put on at the end of the presentation. But if you see what our members are doing in that narrative, it's quite extraordinary. It has a number of areas. I won't go through them there, but specifically the one around SMME development falls here under enterprise and supplier development. But there's a whole lot more as well around education and training that also supports SMMEs, as to the point of this conference and the Minister's address. Then beyond company-led programs, and there are many of them, and please do visit our website to have a look at what Sappi and Mondi and York and Marinsky and all of our larger companies are doing. And by the way, that's just obviously the big programs. There's a whole lot of individual farmers and timber growers around the country helping communities, uplifting SMMEs, but those initiatives aren't big enough to make it into the CSR narrative. So there's a great deal going on. But then as FSA, as Forestry South Africa Sound, ourselves, we have our own business development program. This used to be focused on our thousands of small-scale timber growers who had entered the industry through joint ventures with our main big members. And it now includes all new entrants. We've seen a lot of people coming into the sector through land redistribution and land restitution. And those communities need support as well. So there's a strong focus on assisting everybody who's a new entrant into the sector, irrespective of how they came into forestry. The program is focused obviously on education and training, funding, and we've had some tremendous successes, as I mentioned earlier on, through Norman's intervention, and information sharing. Often what happens for smaller producers in any country in the world and in any sector, one of their limitations is around information. So we're producing phenomenal channels of communication to reach all of our members and all small-scale timber growers in the industry. To the Minister's point, we have had a long-standing and major partnership with the Forest Sector Charter Council. We were founding members of it, as well as the FP&M Seta for training and showcasing women in forestry, and a number of other programs as well. Specifically, I was asked to talk about graduate placement and TVET skills, and the Minister referred to this in his address as well. We've been working with higher education institutions for the last 5 years to do exactly what the Minister was talking about, shaping their curricula, making sure that what they are teaching in higher education institutions meets what's required in the workplace, so that we don't have this gap to which the Minister referred, where people are being educated and they can't find employment. We serve, FSA serves on all of their boards. We've also worked with them over the years to try and match supply and demand, because obviously higher education institutions are also not-for-profit organizations, but they're trying to generate revenue. So we don't want a situation where they're producing 1,000 or 2,000 foresters and forestry technicians, and the country's requirement every year is for a couple of hundred. Linked to this, we also successfully, again through Norman Dlamini's program, managed to secure very generous funding from the Erasmus Plus grant in the EU for a program that's a partnership between 5 South African high institutions dealing with forestry and 2 in Norway and Finland. And importantly here, and this is to the Minister's point, there's also a very strong focus on entrepreneurship, because we're all focused on how do people find employment once they get qualified, how do they get employment, and we want to try and change the narrative from people being job seekers to helping people use those skills maybe to start their own business. This is what we've done in the Forest Sector Charter Council, supporting entities to form their own businesses and provide those services back into industry rather than simply being employees for companies. And this is really important because to what the Minister referred around the changing world of work. So we want people to be skilled up, to have entrepreneurial skills as well as technical skills, so they can take those into wherever there is demand. You know, if you're skilled up in artificial intelligence or coding, you can use those skills in any sector, versus when you've been streamed into a very narrow focus. In terms of the TVET skills, well, exactly the same thing is happening. You know, the nature of forestry of work is changing, and I'll talk about it in a moment. but also in our master plan. This requires us to develop a skills order for the sector, which we are busy doing with the FP&M Seta, so that we can assess to what extent our TVET colleges and our higher education institutions are producing the sort of skills and graduates that are needed in the sector. Just briefly, I've been in this game a long years, 33 years, long time, 33 years in forestry. Old foresters like me that are turning grey will recognize these implements. The implement on the left is called a Pseudohypsometer, and you have to go and stand in the plantation and look up and down at the tree at a certain distance, and it would give you the height. And the DBH caliper on the right would tell you the average diameter of the tree. And then you'd use tables to work up the taper and try and determine the volume. The music has changed dramatically since I was a student 33 years ago down at Nelson Mandela University. You can see on the top left digital hypsometers that all the rage and are still used, but the music has changed. We're now dealing with LiDAR and satellite-based remote sensing, where they will use lasers to determine how many trees are standing, what the volume of timber is on those trees, whether there are pests and diseases, exactly the stuff that the minister was referring to, even in some instances where there are nutrient deficiencies and so on. So these are the kinds of skills that we need to be teaching at both our TVET colleges for technicians and at our higher education institutions for people that are more in the sciences side of it. 5 years ago, when I had an approach from people in the US about using drones to plant trees, the industry sort of scoffed at it because I don't think the way we plant trees in South Africa will ever be able to do this with drones. But we could see already the potential for use of drones in many other applications: fire detection, nutrition, security, and so on. I was in KwaZulu-Natal in February last month, and one of our private timber growers up in Kwambonambi has just bought 2 state-of-the-art drones for doing herbicide application and some of those other functions to which I've referred. So this is no longer the prevail of big business. There's an opportunity for entrepreneurs to get into the space, get their pilot's license, how to fly drones, skill themselves, and start using contracting services to independent timber growers as well as large companies for this kind of technology. There's also been other modernization in our forestry operations. We've seen many mechanized planting, which is a good thing. I can tell you forestry work is arduous. We're often the employer of last resort. Most of the people that do this physical manual labor in the rural areas are women. And by age 36, they are not in good shape. Their backs are hurting and so on. So we've developed systems to try and produce, have a hybrid between human and mechanical planting, big machine that goes along with the planters, and they use these mechanical augers to plant. And the same thing in the harvesting space. FSA also led the development of a mobile winch. That was a partnership again with the Seta, DSI, the minister's other department, UKZN, and ourselves. And this was developed for small scale growers. But as I've said there, as we saw with other toolkits that we developed, as soon as you develop this to try and support small scale enterprises and so on, you often find there's greater uptake by large companies to use with their contractors. And then importantly, not all artificial intelligence is around the replacement of manual operations. There are great opportunities for using AI in training. We have a highly successful VR chainsaw application that FSA developed, again with support from the FP&M Seta. And this is proprietary information available to our members, where we can reduce the risk to people when they're being trained. Chainsaws are extremely dangerous pieces of equipment. So we reduce the risk. People, by the time they've gone through this VR training, they don't have to travel long distances and stay in a training center. They can do it at their workplaces, and then they do a practical application sort of over 2 days at the end of the course. So we anticipate more and more of the use of artificial intelligence in training and not just in the replacement of manual work. And then briefly here, the HRDC to which I referred states that the foundation, therefore, for a dynamic and successful post-school education training system is a strong job creative economy as a first imperative. We have way too many people out of employment. The minister referred to 6% matriculation rate of the people that enter school in grade 1 or grade 00. We've got to address this first and foremost, get people into employment, then we can get in place internships and artisanships and things like this to help them skill themselves up in work. A lot of companies around the world are doing this. They're no longer only hiring people with a 4-year degree. They're saying, we'll take you if you have the right attitude and the right mindset, and we will train you up in an internship program through the organization. And that certainly has to be the case for sectors like ours and agriculture and others. And again, HRDC saying we must constantly regenerate and develop fit-for-purpose skills. And the post-schooling education training sector's ability and agility to rapidly adapt to new global interrupting shifts, that's absolutely fundamental. The disruptors are coming out on a weekly and a monthly basis. We've seen what COVID has done in terms of the way people go to work. I'm sitting at the moment only because I'm feeling a little bit poorly after a jab at home because I can do that. Whereas a few years ago, 3 years ago, we weren't even thinking that that was an option. So in conclusion, Chair, I think the point here is that really the take-home message is we really need to focus our post-school education training institutions and programs around the kinds of skills that are needed to match the changing world of work. And we definitely need to push entrepreneurial education and training. If you look at what's going on in the informal economy in South Africa, in the township economies, people are making good livings and skilling themselves up without being in formal employment anywhere. And I think this is an area where we need to focus and take people out of that informal economy, upskill them so that they can grow their businesses into the formal economy. And again, as I said, I think this is where the opportunities for growth and employment reside, because we've seen that in our ESD programs in the sector. Thank you very much, Chair. And there's our website on the bottom. Please do visit it.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. Mike Peter, Executive Director for Forestry South Africa. Thank you very much, Mr. Peter, for the knowledge that you shared. Most importantly, just to re-emphasize some of the sentiments that you mentioned, it's very important for us to upskill, because we know that upskilling increases knowledge, and as a result we have productive levels that contribute to economic transformation and development. So thank you very much